Hello, my dear friends. How are you? How is it going? I hope I find you all in good health. I'm Mari Thurger, and today I'm going to answer a question posed by one of my patrons, again. And the question was specifically about the idea that the Old Norse word for God originally meant vital force. If there is in fact an Old Norse word for God that originally meant vital force or pillars. So this question seems to be around sometimes. Now, we all know that there are many words in the Old Norse language to refer to God or gods, not necessarily equivalent to the English word God, obviously, but other words in reference to the divine. So, was there ever an Old Norse word referring to the divine, to the gods, that meant originally vital force or pillar? At first, this question might be a little bit strange, but it does make sense in a way, and you will see throughout this video, and throughout this video you might find useful information as well, I hope. So let's take a look, my dear friends, please. What are the Old Norse words for God and or gods? There are several words that mean a god, such as God or good. These two particular spellings are found in texts during the heathen period. I mean, there's no actual such thing as a heathen period, but well, as you know, it's just a term for a better comprehension of the artificial time division between pre-Christian material or contexts before the official Christianization of a culture and between the post-Christian contexts. So, for a better historical understanding. But anyway, indeed these two words appear in such sources during that period, and it seems there were no particular distinctions between the two. When Scandinavia was finally officially converted to Christianity, or Christianity became the official religion, the word good becomes the standard spelling specifically for the Christian God. The etymological root of this word probably most likely comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, which we shall see further ahead, which means to pour. In the sense of libations and offerings, what is given to the divine and the divine gives back. This is the same etymological root we find precisely in the names of a variety of Slavic gods, Slavic deities in general, names ending with bog or boh. The element bog was borrowed from the Indo-Iranian language in prehistoric times. And this element comes from an older form, pagos, meaning portion, that is, of riches or goods, again, the sense of offering. Alternately, it could also be used to also mean the apportioner, that is, God, derived from bag, meaning portion or share of something. One who apportions fortune or something bad, giving something either beneficial or harmful. The entity that provides or gives whatever value or quality of life that God or this divine entity controls. In this sense, a God is seen as an entity which deals out fate, luck, riches, and poverty. Regin, which is gods, powers, rulers, is another Old Norse common word to designate a god, or Ragna, meaning of the gods. It is a word that means the gods, referring to the plural form of the divine, but in the sense of being the rulers, the divinities that are in control. Regin is an extension of this same term, meaning mighty gods. Another extension of this word is reginkunner, meaning divine or of divine origin. We have ot and bond, which are also words referring to a god in the sense of binding, to bond. And of course, Aesir and Vanir, the singular forms are Os and Vanu. We have Tyr, plural Tivar, the name of the one-handed god, but can also be used to refer to any god, a god, cognate with Old Indian Theos, Greek Zeus, Latin Jupiter, as well as Old Indian Deva, Old Irish Dea, Latin Day, Old High German Zeu, and so on and so forth. These are all etymologically related to each other. So Tyr isn't specifically the name of the deity, as it literally means the god, precisely in reference to this deity as having been the god, the original sky deity and ruler of the skies, before it was eventually or progressively in Scandinavia put aside with the rise of the cults of both Odin and Thor. Now, there is the Old Norse word Ginheilög, or Ginheilauger, which is holy, most holy, or sacred. Gin means mighty, which we also find in Ginnungagap, precisely. It is often added on words associated with the gods as an adjective, holy or mighty. Now, as far as I know, and as you can see, these are the words to refer to God or gods or a god, but none means vital force. So I think what we might be looking for is the word megin or main, which is strength, might, power, ability, supernatural strength, supernatural power. Every living thing, be that physical or spiritual, was perceived to have this megin or main, which is by all means vital force, sort of. The gods have megin, and it's called in the sources specifically Os megin, the megin of the Os, the gods, or the god, specifically referring to the vital force of the gods or a particular god, but in other words, it's divine power. This is particularly noticeable in Thor's belt, named Megingjord, literally power belt, from which Thor, the god Thor, draws his vital force, his strength, from the very center of his body. Which is curious, because it actually also corresponds with the Japanese term ki, or the Chinese chi, which are terms that can be found in martial arts, such as Aikido and Tai Chi Chuan. The idea of the vital force precisely at the center of the body, and a belt or a knot concentrating or holding this vital force, this vital strength, this spiritual power. So megin is the word we are looking for in reference to vital force, which is something linked to the gods in Os megin, as was said before, as literally the power or vital force of the gods, of the divine. But can also be found in certain objects belonging to the Norse gods, as we have seen the case of Thor and Thor's belt. And one of Thor's sons is Magna or Magni, from the same root precisely, meaning power, strength, the powerful one, precisely the personification of Thor's mighty power, derived from his belt, from the vital force concentrated in his center, in the center of his body, the navel. There is also Hond, breath, or vital breath. Hond is the same thing as the Inuit Sila and the Polynesian Mana. It's not a vital force, but it's the breath of the world. It's the wind, what is necessary for anything to be alive. We shall get to that. Also, there is Yarda Megin, which I forgot to point out previously, which is the power of the earth itself. And here perhaps we come closer to the meaning of vital power, vital force, the living power of the earth or nature. But it's not that common to find this one. But we do get the sense of the word megin in here, its meaning, and sometimes it's a term attached to the gods as well as people and objects, as was said before. Megin or main also denotes magical power, and this concept is associated with the power shared between all living things. It works as a source of power, a vital force indeed, the essence of all things, all living things. And it is Megin, that is shared between humans and the divine. It is strength, power, spiritual power, vital force, spiritual force. In the case of the gods, they have Os, Megin, which is God or divine power or divine magical power. Megin corresponds, as I've said, to the Japanese ki and the Chinese ki or shi, as was said before, believed to be a vital force forming part of any living entity. In a sense, all these terms are related with one another, including with Hond, the breath. It is the breath of the world, that which gives life. And when something is alive, it will have its own vital force, its own Megin. So Hond is the breath of life. It awakens life in inanimate matter, turning it into a living thing, and from that moment on, that living thing generates its own Megin, its own vital power, its own vital force. It is the animation of life, that's what it is. This vital force conception can also be found in Christian teachings, as the Christian God is believed to be the ultimate source of this vital force, which animates the whole universe. The closer to God one might reach, the more vital force one has or possesses, right? So this is a very old animistic conception, actually, and it's understandable why the Christian God, at least in the Scandinavian, Old Norse Scandinavian sources, written sources, is also the source of this vital force, the Christian God, which the Old Norse people called Hond, breath. The Inuit called it Sila, the Polynesians called Mana, and the Greeks called it Hida. This conception is always related to the wind, the breath of the world, and also related to gods of the wind, precisely, of weather. The animistic belief in the living spiritual entity of the world itself, which resides in the wind, which is perceived to be the breath of the world, always related to sky deities, givers of this breath that gives life in turn. Again, we return to the original idea of God or a God as an entity that gives or a provider of something, right? So, the Christian God, originally, as you know it, wasn't just a sky god, but also a wind god, a god of the weather and the storm, with the exact same roots of the religious roots of the Old Norse god Odin, a storm and wind god before having become a death and war god. And later on in Scandinavia, of course, a god of poetry, and he also became the ruler of the skies, the All Father, king of the gods, and so on and so forth. Now, Odin is the possessor of this Hond, the breath of the world, the breath that gives life, the wind itself, which is precisely the spiritual force that gives life to something. It is curious because in shamanism it is believed that when a child is born, the spirit only enters in the child after the first scream or the first cry, making the wind enter in the body, in the lungs, and thus a child possesses a spirit. It is alive, animated. The exact same concept when Ymir screams existence into being in the Old Norse mythology. But what about an Old Norse word for God or divine that meant pillar? Now, we have to return to the concept of Hond. As said before, Hond is the spirit, the soul, the breath. It is the breath of nature that gives life to all things, the essence of life. It animates matter. There is the Old Norse word, we can find this in medieval Icelandic sagas, which is Ondvegisulur. It starts precisely with Hond, this breath. Ondvegisulur means high seat pillars, or the pillars of the high seat, and they play a particular role in pagan Scandinavian religion. The significance of these pillars, or of the high seat on the north side of the house or the temple, comes most likely from a link between the cult of the ancestors and the cult of the world pillar, represented by the pillars supporting the house or the temple's roof. In the sagas related to the Icelandic settlers, the first Icelandic settlers, we have mentioned precisely that the settlers would throw overboard their Onvegisulur, their high seat pillars, into the sea in sight of land, and then settled wherever the Onvegisulur were washed ashore. For instance, as an example, in Erevígja saga tells us precisely of the Onvegisulur, the high seat pillars, which had pictures of Thor, the god Thor, carved into them, saying that they came from a Norwegian temple. There were a number of first Icelandic settlers that carried with them from mainland Scandinavia. They carried with them the pillars of the high seat of their previous halls or temples. These pillars are the remnants of an ancient prehistoric tradition around the cult of the central pillar. One single wooden beam, which marked the center of the spirituality of prehistoric peoples. We have a couple of examples, such as the central pillar of the house supporting the house and the roof, which was the symbol of the world axis. A single wooden beam in the middle of the prehistoric settlement as well, with the images of the gods carved on them, and stories and mythology of the community, as we find mostly in prehistoric archaeology, but mostly of Eastern Europe, very well preserved. And the very concept of Irminsul and Yggdrasil, the central pillar of the Germanic faith, etc. This ancient cult around the central pillar was kept in pre-Christian Scandinavia in the form of the pillars of the high seat of a great hall or of a temple. And whenever people wanted to settle in a different place, in a different area, they would take these pillars with them and place them in the new land. So most of these pillars had the gods or a specific god carved on them. So these people carried with them their religious heritage. It's the religious heritage of a people transported. So in the case of the first Icelanders, upon coming near land, they threw overboard the Onvegisulur, the pillars of the high seat. And wherever these washed ashore, the settlers would then eventually settle in there precisely. In a symbolic action of letting the gods decide where they should settle, where these people should settle. This could be understood, of course, as letting the spirits of the sea carry the pillars into a safe place, or a place where the spirits themselves deemed it would be a good spot for the newcomers to settle, the humans to settle. Because throughout history, the history of Iceland, even to this day actually, to a certain extent, most Icelanders don't simply settle where they choose. There has always been a great respect and reverence and also fear for the Landveithir, the spirits of the land. And so they would only settle where the Landveithir would let them, to avoid disturbing the land spirits, the local spirits, and later on have troubles with those local spirits. Or to be more precise, having trouble with the main Veithir. And these troubles happened according to the Icelandic folklore and even within the historical accounts precisely of the colonization of Iceland by the first settlers, Norwegians. But it is particularly interesting one specific aspect. As said before, these accounts of the first people to settle in Iceland, some of the pillars were carved with the images of Thor, the god Thor. But of course, not everyone would follow the pillars and settle where they landed. But that's another story. Now, this is, without a doubt, an animistic conception. In animistic beliefs, idols were often carved out of wood or stone, or, well, creating an image that would resemble the idea people had of a physical representation of a particular spirit or entity, or in animistic terms, not a spirit but a non-human person. In animistic beliefs, in order for something to be alive, it must contain a spirit, the breath. It must be animated, or it must contain an entity. And in order for the human being to have physical contact with the spirits or the entities, a physical image is created so that the spirit might inhabit this physical image, and through it act physically. The general basic idea in animism is that the world is absolutely populated with persons. Only a small fraction are human persons. And not everything is alive and contains a spirit as it is usually believed. But many things in the world are entities, are persons, are non-human people, so they have a body and a life of their own. They are alive. But in order for the human animistic community to have a particular entity within their community, and in order to receive the beneficial powers of that entity, the entity itself must be lured to inhabit a new body. So idols are often carved or created, or a fetish, precisely, an inanimate object that will contain the spirit for which it was created, to be worshipped for its magical powers, the Magin, an exchange of Magin. So this is the animistic basic idea, very basic idea, of course, behind the pillars carved with certain images to be inhabited by the non-human person. So it's small wonder why the Saxons, for instance, absolutely lost their wits when their religious icon, Irminsul, was cut down by the Christians. It was probably a great pillar or a tree. The sadness, hatred, and misery felt by the Saxons wasn't because it was a religious item that was brought down, but most likely because the Saxons still held on to certain animistic perceptions of the world. And what actually happened there was the death of the non-human person living or inhabiting in it, in the pillar or the tree. That gave something beneficial to these people, to the community. So the madness involved was for the killing of the living entity that provided Magin, spiritual force or magical power. There is a reason why many ancient statues are missing a nose or arms, limbs in general. Well, certainly time has a hard effect on everything, obviously, but many ancient statues show clear evidences of having been purposely broken or damage done with intent, and I speak about this as an archaeologist. To ancient societies, animism was still present in their religions, which means if objects contained a spirit, an entity, and therefore have supernatural and magical power, Magin, they have essence, they are alive, the hond was given to them, the breath, and therefore are alive and contain Magin, spiritual power. So a spiritual entity could also inhabit a statue. In fact, the earliest creations of statues, of wooden anthropomorphic figures, of course, or little animal totems, well, some material carved to resemble a clear representation of a living thing, a living entity, was precisely so that the spirit of that thing could live in the object made to resemble its image. Contacting physically with the object was contacting directly with the spiritual entity living in it, the non-human person. Animistic pagans were not worshipping the image or the idol per se. They were worshipping the spiritual entity living in it. But of course we must be careful when we use the term spirit, because this is just the English term, the English word, to better explain this, of course. But spirit often denotes something bad, a ghost, a spectrum, wraith, often attributed to the spirits of the departed or of the dead in post-Christian Western literature. So mind that in animistic terms, it's not a dead thing. It's just a person, an entity, and it is alive, it is animated. So, ancient statues, as I was saying, are missing limbs because they were purposely broken. The left arm was to give, to offer, and the right arm was to receive in turn, a symbiotic relationship. If the statue loses its limbs, the spiritual entity, or its non-human person in it, can no longer act through the statue, can no longer receive or give offerings and blessings. So people from outside a specific culture would break the limbs of the statues or of the idols of another culture to stop that culture from offering and receiving blessings and spiritual power and strength and magical power. Statues serve to have the spiritual entity, be that divine land spirit or sometimes ancestors, serve to have it on the physical world of the human beings to act in a physical way. This is also why noses from statues were broken, purposely broken, to prevent it from breathing, from being alive, from receiving the spirit, the breath, the living spiritual entity, the haunt. Now, this doesn't just happen in statues. This also happens in representations of figures in flat surfaces without relief, obviously. Limbs and noses and sometimes eyes purposely removed by making holes or scraps in the surface, and thus the images represented in there are killed, and the spirit of non-human people no longer live inside them. Take the case of the Great Sphinx of Giza. The Egyptian Arab historical accounts of the 15th century tell us precisely that during the 14th century people still made offerings to the Great Sphinx. Mostly peasants, of course, hoping to control the flood cycles for successful harvests. But eventually a Sufi Muslim named Muhammad Sahim al-Dahar was absolutely outraged by this display of devotion by these heathens, these pagans, and ended up destroying the nose of the Great Sphinx. So I suspect for the exact same reasons I've expressed previously, precisely to kill the spirit within the Great Sphinx so it wouldn't be able to take action or to be alive and take action on the physical plane, and so to stop the peasants from worshipping the Sphinx because it would die. Don't worry, he was executed for vandalism. So, this to say that the ondvegisulur is the exact same process, in a way. And in the case of the ones carved with the images of Thor, the god Thor, it was precisely to contain Thor himself. So it wouldn't have been the spirits of the sea, after all, carrying the pillars, but it would be the spirit of Thor himself, the non-human person of thunder, acting through the pillar carved in his image and choosing a proper place to settle. The divine power of Thor acting through the pillars carved in his own image. So, answering the patron's question after this entire explanation, vital force in relation to the divine, to the gods, would be Megin or main, and pillar in relation to the divine or the gods would be the ondvegisulur, the high seat pillars. What are you doing, you little vandal? Breaking the house? Go play with your sister. Well, that's it, my dear friends. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, bye for now.